Forms came back stamped in a color I didn't recognize. That was the first sign, not a warning. Just a fact I filed away the same way I'd filed away a great many facts over the years, quietly, without drama, in the part of my mind that kept track of things that might matter later. The stamped color was a deep amber, the kind that in any human bureaucracy would mean provisional or pending review, or we're not entirely sure what to do with you. On Vithani conservatory forms I would later learn, it meant something closer to the system, has encountered a value outside its acceptable input range and has defaulted to the nearest adjacent category. The nearest adjacent category, in my case, was Tier 4 Support Auxiliary. I read that part twice. Then I folded the forms, put them in my chest pocket next to the thermal liner I still wore out of habit, and went to find the intake desk. The Vithani Conservatory of Strategic Sciences occupied a plateau on a world whose name I will not attempt transliterate. 3 syllables, 2 of which are produced by a vocal apparatus humans don't carry. The plateau was high, the atmosphere thin, and the wind came off the eastern ridgeline in long, low pulses that tasted of dry mineral and something faintly electrical. I had been told this was considered a temperate campus. I took that at face value and made no comment. The intake desk was a curved counter of polished dark stone at the center of a hall, large enough to quarter a salvage barge. The ceiling was a single sheet of something translucent, which let in a diffuse, bluish light that cast no shadow at all. 20-odd alien candidates stood or crouched or hovered in a loose queue before the counter, each of them in a uniform I hadn't been issued. I was still wearing my work clothes, insulated trousers, the thermal liner, a jacket that had been repaired at the left sleeve, with a different colored thread, because the original had torn on a cable housing during my last Antarctic shift. The Duvari behind the counter was the first of its kind I'd seen up close. Tall, narrow, with a thorax that sat at an angle to the rest of its body, as though it had been assembled in 2 separate sittings. Its eyes were pale and laminar, flat, like the surface of standing water, and they tracked me with a kind of detached precision that reminded me of a calibration instrument settling on a measurement. It wore a garment that was less clothing than notation. Bands and panels of material printed with what I would come to understand were status registers, probability indexes, the Duvaris running assessment of everything around them rendered in textile. Continued Orestes. It had my name before I reached the counter. Dak Orestes. Human Terran Standard Physiology. It paused in the way a calculator pauses. Not hesitation, just processing. Your registration has been assigned a provisional classification. Tier 4. Support and auxiliary functions. I saw that, I said. You are not here to contest the classification. It was not a question. It was a probability statement. The Duvari's natural register, I'd learn. They didn't ask whether things were true. They calculated whether they were likely and delivered the result at conversational volume. No, I said. I'm here to understand how it happened. The Duvari's thorax shifted fractionally. Your species code was entered under a legacy classification schema that predates the conservatory's current intake rubric by several hundred standards. The legacy schema has no provision for Terran standard biological candidates, as the conservatory was not accepting human candidates when the schema was written. When the registration was processed, the system mapped your biological file to the nearest compatible template. Another pause. The nearest compatible template was Tier 4. The matching criteria were limited to atmospheric tolerance range and core thermal stability. I thought about that for a moment. The atmospheric tolerance range would have been a reasonable match. My paperwork from the salvage corps listed it as broad. You had to be if you were going to work the Antarctic rigs. The core thermal stability would have matched even better. 11 winters at or below -40. Run equipment that failed on a schedule its designers had not anticipated, in conditions that would have been grounded as unsafe if there had been anyone with authority to ground them. My core thermal stability was, by any measurement, very good. So the system put me in Tier 4 because the only columns it knew to check showed I was qualified for Tier 4. Correct, the Duvari said. You are qualified for Tier 4. And what's Tier 1? The laminar eyes held on me for a moment. Tier 1 is the Advanced Officer Track, Strategic Command, Deep Systems Navigation, Hostile Environment Governance. The intake assessment is a 3-day evaluation. It is not designed for Tier 4 candidates. What's the assessment like? Pause longer than the others. Contridiant Orestes, you are Tier 4. I understand. What's the assessment like? The Duvari, whose designation I had by then gathered, was Savile 3 declining. The numbers and modifier being part of its name, CAS tag, indicating its place in the Duvari probability hierarchy, made a small sound I couldn't categorize, somewhere between a click and the noise a hinge makes when the temperature drops. Then it answered. Cold exposure rating over a continuous 18-hour window. Source deprivation index across a simulated 48-hour field isolation. Decision load scoring under atmospheric hostility conditions involved a pressurized chamber that replicated the thin air high radiation environment of an active gas extraction site, and a final composite evaluation. All 3 stressors applied simultaneously, the candidate required to execute a specific problem-solving task while the system measured degradation in cognitive output against baseline. It told me all of this in the flat, informational tone of something reading from a record. Then it said, Tier 1 intake assessment has a completion rate of 31% among qualifying candidates. B. Qualifying candidates are those who have passed the conservatory's prerequisite screening. You have not passed the prerequisite screening. You are Tier 4. I sit the Tier 1 assessment anyway. The thorax shifted again. Further this time. The intake assessment is open to all registered candidates. This is a procedural baseline established in the conservatory's founding charter. It cannot be restricted on the basis of tier assignment. It paused. This provision was intended to ensure that candidates who were administratively misassigned had a mechanism for correction. I nodded. That sounds like me. Contridiant Orestes. There was something in its voice now that was not emotion. The Duvari, I was learning, did not carry emotion in the way I understood the word, but was a very precise communication of probability. The 3-day assessment will confirm your tier assignment and return you to processing. State this not as judgment, but as a statistical projection. I have administered this assessment for 9 standard years. I have seen 412 candidates attempt it without passing prerequisite screening. It paused. None of them have completed the assessment. I thought about that. None of them? I said. None. What happened to them? In most cases, medical extraction during the cold exposure stage. In some cases, voluntary withdrawal. In 3 cases, reassignment to a care facility after the decision load component. The laminar eyes did not blink. I am required to disclose this. Shh. I appreciate that, I said, and meant it. I had worked with enough systems that didn't disclose their failure modes to appreciate one that did. Still intend to sit the assessment. Again, not a question. Yes, I said. Savile 3 declining made a notation on its register garment with 1 long finger, the material responding to touch by shifting color in a small area near its collar. You will report to Assessment Chamber 12 at the 3rd bell of the morning cycle, it said. You will be issued standard field kit for a Tier 4 candidate. I thanked it. It did not respond to thanks. I would come to understand that the Duvari found the concept mildly baffling, since gratitude implied an outcome had been in question, and outcomes that were not in question required no gratitude. That evening I ate in the General Candidates Hall, a wide, low room that smelled of 3 or 4 alien food preparation traditions at the same time, which is an odor that takes some getting used to, but becomes neutral eventually. I found a table near the far wall and ate what I had been given. An adequate meal, nutritionally calibrated for a Tier 4 support candidate, meant it was designed for a body that would be spending the next few days in moderate comfort administrative functions rather than a 3-day stress evaluation. I ate it anyway and flagged the nutrition deficit in the back of my mind as something to compensate for later. At the adjacent table, a cluster of Tier 1 candidates were discussing the upcoming assessment in low voices. I could understand perhaps 40% of it. My translation implant was standard range, not the enhanced diplomatic tier, and some of what the VETH secondary candidates said came through as approximations rather than equivalents. The shape of the conversation was familiar. The slightly elevated energy, the way they kept returning to specific numbers, the undercurrent of people who are genuinely excellent at what they do and are now facing something that might exceed that excellence. I had been in that conversation, in different rooms, in different languages many times before. On the Antarctic rigs, before a particularly bad weather window. In the salvage corps briefing rooms, before a complex extraction. You learn to recognize the specific quality of attention that very competent people pay to a thing they are not certain they can do. I finished my meal and went to sleep early. Assessment Chamber 12 was a room built to be unpleasant. I recognized this the moment I walked in, with the same low-grade professional recognition I had when I first stepped onto the Antarctic platforms. The recognition of a space that had been deliberately made hard, and made hard in a way that was calibrated, measured, deliberate, not punishing for the sake of punishment. Hard because the work it was testing for was hard. I respected that. I had always respected that. The other Tier 1 candidates were already there. 2 of them. I counted without meaning to. The way you count anything, when you've spent enough time in environments where headcount mattered. They were a cross-section of the conservatory's intake population. Duvari in the minority, a larger group of Veth secondary, 4 of the large, heavily jointed species from the outer systems whose name I couldn't recall, 2 that I had no reference for at all. All of them in fitted Tier 1 kit, which was insulated and laminated, and had the look of equipment that had been engineered very carefully against a very specific list of failure conditions. I was in my own clothes. The Tier 4 kit they'd issued was a single-layer thermal suit that would have been adequate for a temperate outdoor morning. I had folded it and left it at the foot of my bunk. A Proctor, not Duvari, something else, wider and lower slung, with a head that seemed to contain more mass than was strictly necessary. Looked me over with the expression of something, encountering a data point it didn't have a column for. Tier 4, I said helpfully. Your kit, it said. I have what I need. It looked at my jacket, the repaired sleeve, the insulated trousers. It opened its mouth, closed it, then turned to address the room. The briefing was thorough and delivered in a tone I recognized from pre-dev safety talks and pre-operation rig briefings. The tone of someone who had watched this go wrong enough times that they had stopped softening the information. You will experience temperature reduction to approximately -63 standard. You will be without external resource access for the deprivation index. The atmospheric chamber simulates a Class 3 extraction environment with 17% oxygen equivalent and active particulate load. Cognitive degradation is expected and is factored into the baseline calibration. Withdrawal is available at any time via the designated signal. There is no penalty for withdrawal. The proctor went through each stage in detail, told us what the cold would feel like. It told us at what temperature fine motor function would begin to impair. It told us the physiological sequence, shivering, then the cessation of shivering as the body moved past that mechanism, then the particular kind of stillness that preceded medical emergency. It was thorough in the way that briefings are thorough when the people giving them have cleaned up afterward, enough times to know what information would have helped. I noticed too of the Veth secondary exchange a look when the temperature figure was given. -63 standard was, I gathered, considered severe, the kind of number you brace for. I had worked in -58 on the Weddell platform during the winter cycle of my 6th Antarctic year, doing a cable housing replacement that should have been a 2-hour job and became a 9-hour job when the secondary clamp seized, and we had to cut the whole housing manually, one hand on the tool and one hand keeping the cable taut, with a wind coming off the ice shelf that was clocking around 60 kilometers per hour, and the sun already below the horizon. My foreman at the time, a Finnish woman named Layla, who had been working the Antarctic rig since before I was born, had said afterward, "You did not complain." I had not thought of it as a thing that required comment. Stage 1 was the cold exposure. They walked us into a chamber that occupied the full back section of Assessment 12. High ceiling, white walls, floor made of some non-conductive composite. The temperature when we entered was ambient. Then the room started to drop. I knew the drop curve by feel. I had spent enough time in enough cold that my body had its own read on temperature, not as a number but as a set of physical states. The chamber passed through what I would have called brisk at around -8. It passed through cold, genuinely cold, the kind that starts to pull at exposed skin, at around -20. Around -35 it reached what the rigs called working cold, where equipment started to think about failing, and you started to think more deliberately about each movement. The other candidates were responding, not panicking. They were Tier 1. They had screening behind them. They were not people who panicked, but responding. The Veth secondary shifted their mass distribution, redistributing warmth in some biological process I didn't understand. The large jointed species from the outer systems pulled their limbs closer, reducing surface area. One of the unidentified species began a low vocalization I suspected was some kind of physiological regulation. I sat down on the floor, not as a performance. It was simply the most efficient thing to do. Reduce wind chill exposure, which, in a chamber with active cooling, meant getting below the worst of the air circulation, the non-conductive floor between my body and any upward heat loss. I had learned this on the platforms in the early years, when I was still the kind of person who learned things because they hurt. The proctor, watching from behind a transparent panel at the chamber's end, made a notation. There is a specific quality to cold when it gets serious, not painful. After the first hour, pain is a response your nervous system runs when it believes the information will help you, and deep cold eventually convinces your nervous system that the information is no longer actionable. What you're left with is a kind of heavy stillness, a sense of thickness in the extremities, and a mental state that is not impaired exactly, but is very focused, in the way that a fire is focused when there isn't much fuel left. Every unnecessary thought gets cut. What remains is what you actually need. I had learned to work in that state. The rigs had taught me, because on the rigs the cold was not the job. The job was the job, and the cold was just the conditions the job came in. By -50, 4 candidates had signaled withdrawal. One of the Veth secondary and 3 of the outer systems jointed species. They left quietly, with their heads down, the way people leave when they know the walk to the door will be watched. By -60, 2 more were gone. At -63, where the chamber held for the remaining duration, 6 standard hours by the display on the wall, though I wasn't watching the display, there were 15 of us left. I was one of them. I was also the only one still sitting on the floor. One of the Duvari candidates had migrated toward the same area at around hour 2, lowering itself in what I recognized as a core preservation posture. It looked over at me with those flat laminar eyes and said nothing. I said nothing back. We sat in the cold for the remaining 4 hours like 2 people waiting for the same bus. I was, I think, the warmer of the 2 of us, which I did not mention because it seemed unkind. At the 6-hour mark, the temperature began to rise. I watched the others around me re-engage with motion as the ambient crept back up. Careful, incremental movements. Discipline of people who knew not to rush that process. They knew their physiology. They had been trained for this. I stood up, checked my hands. Good fine motor, which was the important thing, and rolled my shoulders. The proctor behind the glass was watching me, with an expression I was beginning to recognize as the look of someone whose model was showing an unexpected number. Stage 2 was the Resource Deprivation Index. They gave each candidate a kit, a sealed case approximately the size of a document bag, which contained a specified list of materials. Not survival tools. They were clear about that. Materials. Raw elements and objects from which tools might be constructed. If one had the applicable knowledge and fine motor function at temperature, which was, of course, the entire point. The cold exposure stage left you in a state of managed impairment, and Stage 2 was designed to assess whether you could still function in that state. I opened my case. The materials were, by the reckoning of whatever committee has assembled this kit, minimal. A sealed thermal packet containing a gel fuel of some kind, 40 milliliters, which was enough to run a small burner for perhaps 90 minutes if you were careful. 3 meters of braided filament was strong but not load-bearing at any serious scale. A composite sheet, roughly the size of a pillowcase, designed for thermal insulation. A multi-tool of Veth engineering, which had 8 functions, of which perhaps 5 were relevant to field survival. And a problem brief, a folded card describing a scenario in which the candidate was required to maintain core temperature, establish a water source from the ambient environment, and signal for extraction within a 48-hour simulated window. I read the brief. Then I looked at the materials. Then I did the arithmetic. The arithmetic was not complicated, but I was aware that for many people, it would have been. Not because they lacked the intelligence. The Tier 1 candidates were not unintelligent. Because intelligence and field arithmetic are not the same thing. And field arithmetic is something you develop by needing it, repeatedly, in situations where being wrong has a cost that is paid in something other than points. I have been doing this arithmetic since I was 22, 11 years of it. On rigs that didn't always have the right equipment. In weather that didn't wait for the equipment you ordered. Teams of varying competence and morale. Against deadlines set by operational schedules that existed in office conditions. And didn't account for ice. The thing about limited resources is that they teach you to look at everything twice. The first look is obvious. You see what the object is. The second look is the useful one. You see what the object can do that it wasn't built to do. The gel fuel was a thermal element and a fire source. Yes. But the container it came in was a sealed thermal casing that would retain heat after the burn element was spent. Changed how long the fuel needed to last if you were thinking about it correctly. The composite sheet was insulation, cut in the right proportions. It was also a windbreak and a thermal reflector, which tripled its effective utility. The braided filament was not load-bearing, but it was tensile, which meant, under tension, rather than compression, it was more than adequate for a low structural frame. I worked through the kit methodically. The gel fuel and the composite sheet were the thermal anchor, a small reflective shelter with a controlled burn element, positioned to maximize retained body heat against the ambient. Standard Antarctic principle. It's not about generating enough heat. It's about not losing what you have. The multi-tool had a condenser blade function that I wasn't sure the VETH engineers had intended for water extraction. But the geometry was right, and when I found a surface in the chamber with a slight temperature differential from ambient air, I could run a passive condensation cycle. The braided filament was the anchor for the shelter structure. 3 meters was enough for a low frame. Once I found the right attachment points in the chamber walls, standardized fastening points for equipment mounting, which were not intended for improvised shelters, but worked adequately. I had the shelter constructed, the burn element lit at a controlled rate, condensation collection set up in 41 minutes. I know it was 41 minutes because the proctor noted the time on the wall, display, and the candidate next to me, one of the Duvari, not the one who had sat beside me in stage 1, looked at my shelter, looked at the display, and said something in its own language that the translation system rendered as an expression of computational doubt. Disbelief. The Duvari I was learning did not disbelieve things they could verify. It was doubt in the technical sense, recalibration of probability in response to incoming data. The shelter I had built was not elegant. It was the kind of structure a person builds when they have the right components and nothing else. Functional, compact, fully adequate for its purpose, and completely indifferent to how it looked. On the Antarctic platforms, we called this a working fix as opposed to a proper repair. You used working fixes when the weather was bad, and the schedule was tight, and the proper repair could wait for a port call. I had made hundreds of them. By hour 12 of the 48-hour deprivation window, 6 of the remaining 15 candidates had signaled. Kits were intact. They had the right ideas in some cases, or partially right ideas, but the execution had foundered. Fine motor function, mostly. The cold had already done its work on people who had not spent the last 11 years being cold on purpose. By hour 30, there were 9 of us. By hour 44-7, I kept working, not frantically. That was the other thing about the rigs. There was always more to do. And the candidates who had lasted this far had good instincts about prioritizing. But good instincts under stress will still accelerate. You start moving fast the situation requires, because moving feels like progress. I had been corrected on this, physically, and by example enough times to have the lesson in the bone. Slow is smooth, and smooth is complete, and complete is the only thing that matters. I ate a portion of the gel fuel tablet, not its intended use. The compound was caloric and non-toxic for humans, which I had confirmed by examining the packaging label, on hour 18, and rationed the rest. I slept for 4 hours in the window from hour 20 to hour 24, using the shelter's retained heat, and woke feeling roughly as I had woken on every cold weather morning of my working career. Stiff in the large joints, functional, ready for work. Around hour 36, one of the remaining candidates, a Veth secondary, the tallest of the group, who had been working steadily and well, ran into trouble with its condensation setup and lost its water collection. I watched it work through the problem for about 20 minutes. It had the right concept, but the wrong geometry. The angle of the condenser blade needed to shift by about 15 degrees to account for the temperature differential in its area of the chamber, which was running warmer than mine due to body heat from a cluster of candidates earlier in the stage, caught its eye, and adjusted the angle on my own setup by way of demonstration, not saying anything, just doing the movement slowly and clearly where it could see. It watched, it adjusted its setup. The condensation cycle resumed. It looked at me for a moment, with whatever the Veth secondary equivalent of surprise was, then turned back to its work. Neither of us mentioned it. There was nothing to mention. The proctor behind the panel made a longer notation this time. Stage 3 was the atmospheric chamber, 17% oxygen equivalent, active particulate, thin pressure. They warned us before we went in that cognitive function would be affected. We're correct. The particulate load was an irritant rather than a toxin, designed to simulate the experience of working a gas extraction site without the liability of actual poisoning, and the thin pressure hit you in the head in a way that was specific and unmistakable. Not dizziness, but a kind of cognitive lag, a delay between having a thought and being able to act on it. I had worked the atmospheric anomaly platforms on the Falklands extension, which ran below standard sea level pressure due to a geological quirk in the substrate. I had also worked in mined tunnels on 2 subcontractor jobs that technically violated ventilation standards, though I had not known this at the time and had discovered it afterward when the paperwork surfaced during a regulatory review. The lag was familiar, not comfortable. Familiar is not comfortable, but known. You could work in it, if you had learned to work in it. The key was accepting the delay rather than fighting it. If you fought it, you accelerated. And acceleration in bad air is how you make mistakes. If you accepted it, you just adjusted your timing. Everything took slightly longer, so you built that into your estimates and stopped expecting to operate at normal speed. It was like running a machine in cold weather. You didn't expect full performance. You dialed in your expectations to match the conditions, and you got the work done anyway. The task in Stage 3 was a decision tree. A series of operational problems presented sequentially on a screen, each with a time limit, each branching based on your previous answers. The whole structure designed to collapse into an impossible choice at the end, unless you had navigated specific earlier decisions correctly. It was a good test, the kind of test that required you to think about consequences. 3 decisions ahead, while your head was full of bad air, and you were already on hour 67 of a 72-hour assessment window. I found the spine of the decision tree in the first 12 problems and stayed on it. This was not remarkable intelligence. It was pattern recognition, which is different. Pattern recognition is what you develop when the consequences of failing to recognize a pattern are immediate and physical and paid in your own blood and other people's equipment budgets. I had recognized the shapes of operational decision trees because I had lived inside several of them in conditions where getting it wrong meant leaving a crewmate on a structure that was no longer safe to be on. You learn the difference, after enough time in the field, between the problems that look hard and the problems that are hard. The ones that look hard are usually complex, with many variables and many possible inputs. The ones that are hard are usually simple, with a small number of correct paths and consequences for choosing wrong that matter. The decision tree in Stage 3 was the second kind. Once I saw the rest was execution. I navigated to the intended endpoint with 2 minutes remaining. I was the only candidate to do so. Of the original 22, 4 completed Stage 3. 3 of them completed it with time to spare. One of them cut it close. 19 seconds, and then there was me. The proctor's notation this time was longer than the previous ones, and it looked over at me with an expression I had stopped trying to read by stage 2. The composite assessment was the final stage. All 3 stressors, applied simultaneously with a new problem brief. The brief was simple in its description and not simple in its execution. You were to navigate a simulated field environment. A room laid out as a ruined or degraded structure, with elements of cold, poor air, resource scarcity, and extract a listed set of specified items from specified locations within a 4-hour window, while the system measured the rate at which your cognitive and physical performance degraded against your baseline profile from the previous stages. My baseline profile, I suspected, was unusual. I went in with the 4 candidates who had completed stage 3. We were spread across the room by the briefing parameters, each to our own section. No coordination, individual assessment. I looked at my section, did the field arithmetic, and started. The section they had assigned me was not the easiest of the 4. The far corner, 2 of my target items were located, had the lowest ambient temperature in the room and the worst air quality, both of which I gathered were intentional. The items were partially obscured by a low structural element, which required getting down to work level, which meant cold floor contact. None of this was interesting to me in the way it was probably intended to be. It was just the job. You find the hardest parts first, account for them in your time estimate, build in your margins, and work the sequence from most constrained to least constrained, so you're using your best capacity where it matters most. I cleared the hard corner in the first 40 minutes. After that, it was recovery work. The kind of methodical extraction you could run on partial function, which was good, because by hour 2 of the composite stage, I was running on partial function, not dramatically impaired, just at the end of a long effort, in conditions that had been asking something of me continuously for the better part of 3 days, and feeling it the way you feel a long job near its end. Aware of the accumulated weight of it, neither beaten by it nor pretending it wasn't there. There is a moment, in every long, hard job, where the question becomes not whether you can do the work, but whether you will. Not capability, disposition. The capability is known at that point. You know what you have left. You've been taking inventory for hours. The question is whether you'll use it to finish rather than to stop. I had answered that question enough times to have stopped thinking of it as a mission. I will not describe the entire 4 hours in detail, because 4 hours of methodical work in a degraded environment is not dramatically interesting from the outside. From the inside, it was the same as every other field job I had done in conditions that were trying to kill me. Careful, deliberate, attentive to what the environment was telling me, and unglamorous. There was a moment, at around the 3-hour mark, where I found myself crouched under a low structure in the worst corner of the section. Highest particulate density, lowest ambient temperature, slight line to the next objective. Eating the last of a caloric supplement bar I had found in a kit cache at hour 2, and thinking about Layla, foreman from the Weddell platform. She had a saying, "You are not here to feel what it is like. You are here to get the work done." I got the work done. I extracted the listed items from the listed locations with 11 minutes to spare. The room was quiet when I set the last item on the collection tray. Not performing quiet, actually quiet. The proctor at the observation panel had been joined at some point. I hadn't noticed when, by a second figure. Duvari, narrow-built, laminar eyes. The register garment was more elaborate than the proctor's, more columns of notation, more bands of status-marking material. I recognized the affect, if not the specific individual, administrative tier. Someone with a file on this assessment. The laminar eyes found me across the room and held. I had set down the item and straightened up, and I was aware of being looked at in a way that was more than standard observation. There was a quality to it that I associated with people encountering something that didn't match the picture they'd had in their heads. Not hostility, not admiration. Something more precise than either, particular attention of a system that has received an output outside its expected range, and is now trying to determine what column to put it in. The final scoring was done in a separate chamber, a neutral room with a table, a data terminal, and 2 chairs. 1 chair for me and one for Savile 3 declining, who had apparently left the intake desk to attend the composite assessment's conclusion in person. It sat across from me with its register garment, shifting in slow patterns I was not yet literate in. It had a data terminal open between us, and it was reading from it with the same flat precision it had applied to everything since I first stood at its counter. Condidient Orestes, it said. Your composite assessment score has been returned. Good, I said. There is a difficulty, I waited. The conservatory's intake scoring system operates on a calibrated scale. The calibration was established across 412 years of assessment data. Within this data, theoretical maximum, a score representing completion of all elements at the highest efficiency threshold with zero degradation, has never been achieved. It functions as a ceiling rather than a target. Saville 3 declining's thorax shifted. Composite score exceeds the calibration ceiling in 3 of the 4 measured categories. I thought about that. How does that happen, I said. It happens when the degradation model fails to account for the candidate's actual baseline. The Duvari's flat eyes were very still. The model assumes a standard physiological baseline and calculates degradation from that point. The degradation in your case is real. Your physical and cognitive function declined across the assessment in measurable ways. However, your baseline was sufficiently elevated that the decline still resulted in an absolute performance above the ceiling in the relevant categories. Because my baseline is calibrated for worse conditions. Correct. A pause. The conservatory has no column for candidates whose functional baseline was established by repeated exposure to conditions more severe than those the assessment can produce. Another pause, longer. This was considered an unnecessary provision. No such candidates were anticipated. I looked at the data terminal. I could not read the notation on it, but I could read the shape of a result. The way you read the shape of weather, without knowing the technical language for it. So, where does that leave the filing, I said. Your Tier 4 assignment cannot stand. The scoring system will not accept it. Saville 3 declining's thorax shifted again, further than I had seen it move. Classification is required. To Tier 1, Tier 1 is the maximum tier within the current classification structure. It looked at the terminal. Your scores in the cold exposure and resource deprivation categories would qualify for a tier that does not exist in current structure. A pause. Tier 1 will be the recorded classification. It is the highest available designation. I nodded. The formal notation on your record, Saville 3 declining continued, will indicate a catastrophic filing error at intake. This is the term used when the intake system returns a classification result that is demonstrably incorrect by a margin that could not be attributed to candidate error or system misfunction, but to a failure of the system's categorical scope. I sat with that for a moment. A failure of categorical scope. The system had not made an arithmetic mistake. It had not misread my data. It had simply been built against a set of assumptions about what a candidate could plausibly be. And I had not been that thing, and so it had filed me in the nearest category that fit its assumptions. Tier 4. Support and auxiliary functions. The record will also note, Saville 3 declining said, that this assessment cycle included 22 candidates total, whom 4 completed the 3-stage evaluation, and 1 completed the composite assessment within parameters. 1, I said. You are the one, it said, as though confirming a fact I might have been uncertain about. I considered asking what would happen to the record, whether it would be reviewed, whether the notation would be expunged in a later filing cleanup, the way administrative corrections sometimes disappear into subsequent revisions. I decided not to ask. It seemed like the kind of question that hoped for an answer that wasn't coming. The Tier 1 housing assignment will be issued today, Saville 3 declining said. The first term begins on the 7th cycle. You are expected to attend orientation for incoming Tier 1 candidates. I said I understood. The Duvari rose. Not in the way humans rise, but in the efficient, single motion way of a body built for vertical transitions, and paused before it turned to leave. Continident Orestes, it said. I stated, at our initial meeting, that the assessment would confirm your tier assignment and return you to processing. This was a statistical projection based on 412 years of data. The laminar eyes held on me for a moment. Projection was incorrect. Yes, I said. This is noted in my record as well. It paused. It is the first incorrect projection I have issued in 9 standard years of administering this assessment. I didn't know what to say to that. Said nothing. Sometimes that's the right answer. Outside, through the translucent ceiling of the intake hall, the sky above the plateau was the color of old steel, the kind that's been out in the weather long enough to develop character. The wind was still coming off the eastern ridgeline in those long, low pulses. I could feel them through the walls, not feel them exactly, but sense the pressure differential, the way the air moved around the building in response to something larger moving past. 11 years on the Antarctic platforms teaches you to feel weather, not predict it. Nobody predicts it, not reliably, not in the places where I worked, but feel it. Understand it as a physical fact that occupies space and has consequences and will not be argued with. The Duvari were, I had gathered, excellent at prediction. Their entire cognitive architecture was built around probability models and calibrated projections. They could tell you with impressive accuracy what was going to happen and in what order and to what degree. Saville 3 Declining had told me, on the morning this began, that the assessment would confirm my tier assignment and return me to processing. It had stated this not as a wish but as a statistical projection, the output of a model that had processed 412 years of data. The model had been right in its way. The assessment had confirmed my tier assignment. It just turned out the assignment had been wrong. I stood in the intake hall for a while after Saville 3 Declining returned to its desk. Not doing anything in particular, not celebrating, not thinking profound thoughts. Mostly I was aware that I was tired, and that the specific quality of tiredness I was carrying was the same quality I had carried at the end of every long field job. The clean kind, the kind that comes from having done the work and not having cut anything short, the kind that does not contain regret about what was left undone. There is a thing that happens at the end of a hard job that I have never been able to explain well to people who haven't done hard work in hard places. The work was not enjoyable in the conventional sense. You would not have chosen those conditions. The cold was cold, the bad air was bad. The lack of resources was genuinely limiting in ways that required solving. None of it was designed for your comfort or your ease, but there is a satisfaction in it. On the other side, that has nothing to do with the result, and everything to do with the fact of having been present in it, of having not left, of having done the arithmetic when the arithmetic was hard, and implemented the solution when the implementation was uncomfortable, and kept working when the work asked more than seemed reasonable to ask. I had learned that satisfaction in 11 years on the Antarctic platforms. It was not something I had been taught. It was something the platforms had deposited in me, slowly, across a very large number of very cold hours. In the same way ice deposits minerals in the rock it moves over, not conspicuously. Just there when you look. Saville 3 Declining, behind its counter, looked up once. The laminar eyes were unreadable in the specific way all Duvari eyes were unreadable. Not closed. Not withholding. Just not built to carry what human faces carry. But there was something in the posture of the thorax, the angle of the register garment, that I had begun to learn was the Duvari equivalent of attention that had been recalibrated. Not surprise. The Duvari didn't experience surprise in the sense I understood it, but recalibration, the internal adjustment of a model in response to incoming data that did not fit the previous version of the model. They told me later, one of the other candidates, a Veth secondary named something I could approximate as Orith, who had also completed stage 3 and was something between mystified and respectfully baffled by my presence in the tier, that the intake record notation would persist. That intake records at the Vethena Conservatory were permanent and auditable, and that the specific notation catastrophic filing error, categorical, scope failure, had been used 11 times in the conservatory's 400-year history, and, in every previous case had been applied to records in which the filing error was a simple administrative mistake, wrong candidate in the wrong room, wrong data entered in the wrong field. Never, in 400 years, had it been applied to a case where the intake system's categorical scope had failed to account for a candidate who was simply beyond the range it had been designed to measure. I asked Orith what the notation meant practically, whether it had consequences beyond the record. It said, The record is used in the curriculum. That the conservatory's methodology program drew on intake records as case studies. That the notation attached to mine would eventually be pulled for analysis. That at some point in the future, a cohort of students would sit in a room and work through the question of why a 400-year-old intake system had filed a candidate as Tier 4 when the candidate was, by the assessment's own measurement, beyond the range of any existing tier. Orath said this without any particular inflection. It was simply information. I thought about it for a while. The idea that the record would outlast this conversation, this assessment, this plateau, and become a lesson in some future curriculum was not something I had thought about. When I sat down in the cold at the start of Stage 1, I had not been thinking about posterity. I had been thinking about the floor and the air circulation and the most efficient position for heat, tension. But then that was always how it went. You did the work, and the work left a mark, and later, someone found the mark and tried to figure out what had made it. The conservatory amended the intake rubric 3 weeks after my assessment. New species classification columns, new baseline parameters for candidates whose prior occupational record indicated repeated long-duration exposure to conditions outside the assessment's designed severity range. New language for the tier assignment algorithm that flagged human candidates, specifically for manual review before automated classification. They sent me a copy of the amendment as a courtesy. Standard conservatory policy, apparently, when a candidate's results required a structural revision to the intake process. The amendment was 6 pages of technical notation and 2 pages of explanatory text. The explanatory text summarized the reason for the change as, assessment cycle data indicates that legacy classification schema produced systematic misassignment for candidates of Terran Standard Biology, whose occupational history included repeated long-duration hostile environment fieldwork. The existing rubric lacked input categories sufficient to represent this candidate profile. Amendment introduces new input fields and recalibrates tier assignment thresholds accordingly. 6 pages of notation and 2 pages of text to say, we didn't have a column for this, and now we do. My intake record had been updated. I was Tier 1. The notation on the record read, catastrophic filing error. Categorical scope failure, species, Terran Standard. I kept the amendment document. It lives in my personnel file alongside my Salvage Corps service record and my Antarctic deployment log, which is 47 pages long and contains entries like cable housing replaced, 19 hours, -58, wind 60 kph, no casualties and equipment failure on secondary clamp, manual workaround, hull integrity maintained, team rotated at hour 11, no drama, just work. Just the work that was there. Savile 3 declining in the notation it appended to my file alongside the reclassification had written something that the translation system rendered as, candidate's performance indicates that the intake assessment, as currently structured, cannot produce conditions sufficient to establish a meaningful degradation baseline for this candidate type, which was a very precise and very Duvari way of saying the same thing Layla had said to me at the end of the Weddell platform cable housing job, standing in the wind at -58 after 9 hours on the structure, with her hands red from the cold, and her jacket, half frozen where the spray had caught it. She had looked at the completed work. She had looked at me. She had said, good, that was it. No fanfare, no performance, just the word. At the right time, because the work was done. I thought about that when I read Savile 3 declining's notation. Then I put it in my file and went to find the Tier 1 housing block because I had been Tier 4 that morning and I had not yet been assigned a bunk in the right building. The Duvari at the housing desk looked at my reclassification form. It looked at me. It looked at the form again. Then it assigned me a bunk in Tier 1, Block 7, with the window facing the eastern ridgeline, where the wind came off the plateau in long, steady pulses. I put my bag down and sat on the bunk and listened to the wind. It was not so different from the ice.